The story of our movie today begins with the sound of an alarm ringing, waking Mike up from his sleep. He gets up, washes his face, and drinks some tea to start his day feeling refreshed and focused. But something strange happens. Mike starts noticing unusual things around him, especially when he spots some odd movement in the backyard. He heads to his small office and sits at his desk, only to hear banging and loud noises coming from outside. When he looks out the window, he sees Gina and her husband, Scott, arriving in the neighborhood to move into their new home as Mike's new neighbors. Mike steps out of his house to greet Scott and learns that Scott works for a car marketing company. Mike is immediately impressed by Scott's cars, and Scott offers to let him take any car he likes for a drive or a trip. He even tells Mike he could buy one on installment if he's interested. However, Mike politely declines, explaining that he already has a car and doesn't plan to change it anytime soon. Then Gina joins the conversation, greets Mike, and shakes his hand. Mike offers to host a small welcome party for them to meet the neighbors. They thank him for his kindness and agree. Later that evening, we see Mike preparing dinner as his wife, Lisa, comes home after a long day at work. He tells her about his plan to invite the new neighbors, Scott and Gina, over for a welcome party. Although Lisa is tired from her hectic day, she agrees in the end. The party happens, and Scott shows off his fancy, latest model cars. One of the neighbors, Brian, doesn't seem interested at all in Scott's cars or his bragging. At one point, Scott asks Gina to check if the burgers are ready. Gina replies cheerfully and heads to the grill, where Mike is standing. She asks him about the burgers, and they strike up a casual conversation. After the party ends, everyone returns to their homes. Mike talks to Lisa and tells her he feels like Scott doesn't deserve someone like Gina because Scott seems arrogant and full of himself, while Gina is humble and down-to-earth. Lisa disagrees, saying that Scott is a nice and respectable guy who isn't as bad as Mike thinks. Lisa then goes to bed to rest, while Mike returns to his office to finish some work. While sitting at his desk, he notices Gina through the window of her house, in her bedroom. He keeps watching her, unable to look away, especially when Scott enters the room. The couple shares an intimate and romantic moment together, leaving Mike feeling sad and envious. He reflects on how his own relationship with Lisa has grown cold and routine, far from what it used to be. The events of the story begin when Mike goes to his office in the morning as usual and drinks his tea, just like every day. However, while sitting at his desk, he notices Gina wearing a short denim hot short near their swimming pool. Gina is seen setting up a lounge chair by the pool to relax on. Mike seems like he's looking for an excuse to meet her, so he heads out to his garden, and sure enough, Gina notices him and comes over to talk to him. Mike tells her that he designed his garden himself because he loves gardening and is very passionate about it. Gina invites Mike to her house, and he accepts the invitation. While there, they chat about creating a home garden, and Mike gives her tips on how to plant flowers, trees, and herbs. They spend a long time talking and enjoying each other's company. Later, Mike excuses himself and returns to his house to resume his work. But even in his office, he finds it hard to concentrate as his thoughts keep drifting back to Gina. He starts peeking out the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. Suddenly, Mike notices an argument between Gina and her husband, Scott. He becomes tense and very concerned for Gina. The next morning, Mike is sitting with his neighbor Brian, chatting outside. Mike goes into the house to grab some drinks for Brian, but when he returns, he finds Brian peeking through the garden fence, looking into Scott and Gina's yard. Brian sees Gina wearing her short denim hot shorts and comments, "Mike, you're so lucky to have a neighbor like Gina." Mike feels embarrassed and doesn't know how to respond. That night, Mike is lying in bed with his wife, Lisa. They share a very romantic evening, but Mike finds himself imagining he's with Gina instead of Lisa. The following morning, Gina is shown relaxing and sunbathing by the pool in revealing and very provocative clothing. As usual, Mike watches her from his office window, unable to take his eyes off her. A while later, Scott arrives and starts talking to Gina. Mike tries to look away but can't resist and starts watching them again. Unfortunately, Scott notices Mike spying on them through the window. A few hours later, while Mike is in his garden, he hears another argument between Scott and Gina. It sounds serious, as if someone is being slapped. Mike quickly moves to another spot in the garden where he can get a clearer view of what's happening between Scott and Gina. He feels deeply upset and worried about Gina's safety. That evening, while Mike is in his office, he keeps glancing out the window, hoping to see Gina and make sure she's okay. After a while, he hears the voices of his wife, Lisa, and his son, Alex, as they return home. Mike went to his son Alex, greeted him warmly, and later they sat down to eat together as we see. Mike suggested they go out somewhere to celebrate Alex's return, but Alex told them he couldn't because he had plans to meet his friends later that night. Later that night, Mike went to his office, drinking a beer as usual, and started watching Scott and Gina. He noticed that they had reconciled and were spending a pleasant time together. The next morning, Mike went to the supermarket and then attended a small gathering with his neighbor Brian. They got into a long conversation, which eventually led to talking about their new neighbors, Scott and Gina. Mike told Brian that Scott always fights with Gina and even hits her, expressing his deep concern for her. When Mike returned home, he was surprised to find Scott at his house with his wife Lisa and their son Alex. Scott tried to be friendly and invited them to a party at his house, but Mike and Lisa declined, saying they were busy. However, Alex agreed and went with Scott. At his office, Mike saw Gina and her friends wearing swimsuits at the pool. Mike's attention was entirely focused on Gina. Later, he left the office and talked to his wife, Lisa, expressing his unease about Scott. He told her he wanted to keep Alex away from him and mentioned that Scott constantly argues with Gina and hits her. Lisa began to suspect that Mike might be attracted to Gina. One day, Mike saw Gina outside her house alone, so he went to talk to her. He told her he had noticed her arguing with Scott. She tried to downplay it, telling him that Scott was just stressed from work and that he only behaves that way when he's drunk. The next day, Gina called Mike and asked him to accompany her to the supermarket. He agreed and went with her. They talked a lot and laughed together. On the way back, Gina suggested they smoke a couple of marijuana joints together, and Mike agreed. They went to Gina's house, where they smoked. During their conversation, Gina opened up about her relationship with Scott, saying she felt unsafe and scared with him. Mike advised her to leave Scott if she wasn't happy and assured her he would support her. Gina was grateful for Mike's kindness and hugged him, tears streaming down her face. But she suddenly stopped and told him he should leave. A few days later, Mike overheard Scott and Gina arguing. He climbed over the garden fence and went to their house to intervene, but Scott told him to leave and accused him of being attracted to Gina. Mike denied it, but he returned home and told Lisa everything that had happened. After hearing the story, Lisa was angry and told Mike that he was wrong to interfere in their neighbors' personal lives. That night, Lisa confronted Mike, saying she knew he no longer loved her and that he was only thinking about Gina. She then asked for a divorce, and Mike agreed. Before leaving, Mike went to say goodbye to Gina. She told him that she, too, would be leaving the house, breaking up with Scott, and planning to move to San Diego. Mike offered to accompany and support her, but she politely declined and thanked him for his kindness. Later, Mike left the house and checked into a hotel in the city. He called his son, Alex, and informed him about his separation from Lisa, asking Alex to take good care of his mother during this difficult time. Afterward, Mike called his neighbor Brian and told him everything that had happened. Brian suggested that Mike move on by signing up for online dating websites to meet new women, but Mike rejected the idea, expressing confidence that he could fix things with Lisa and make their relationship even better than before. Mike also shared with Brian that Jenna had broken up with Scott, left their home, and moved to San Diego. However, Brian surprised Mike by revealing that he had just seen Jenna with Scott at a gas station. This made Mike very worried about Jenna. The next day, Mike returned to the house and knocked on the door, but no one answered. He entered the house with a bouquet of flowers, waiting for Lisa to come home so he could surprise her and try to reconcile. While waiting, he saw Jenna sitting in the garden talking to his son Alex. Watching them from behind the fence, Mike called out to Alex. Jenna came over and spoke with Mike, explaining that her decision to leave the house and move to San Diego was neither right nor a good idea. She had decided to stay and try to fix her relationship with Scott, especially after finding out she was pregnant. Mike was shocked to hear this but tried to stay composed in front of her. Later, he returned to the house and prepared dinner for Lisa, hoping to surprise her when she returned. When Lisa came home, she asked him to respect her decision to separate and leave immediately. Mike pleaded with her to have dinner together and talk things over, but she refused, insisting on her decision. Mike agreed, saying he would eat dinner alone and leave afterward. Mike sat and ate the dinner he had prepared by himself. Later, he stepped outside and saw Jenna smoking a cigarette. He approached her and told her that smoking was harmful, especially for pregnant women. At that moment, Scott appeared and saw Jenna with Mike. He called Jenna and told her to come inside immediately. When Scott noticed she was smoking, he got very upset and forcefully grabbed her by the arm. Mike intervened, trying to stop Scott from treating her so harshly. Scott pushed Mike forcefully, but Mike responded with a strong punch, knocking Scott to the ground. Scott grabbed Jenna and pulled her into the house. Mike followed them inside, trying to intervene again, but Scott hit him once more, demanding that he leave immediately and stay out of their family matters. In a fit of anger, Mike grabbed a golf club and struck Scott hard, causing him to collapse to the ground, bleeding heavily. Both Jenna and Mike were in shock over what had just happened, unsure of what to do next. Jenna turned to Mike and demanded he leave immediately, saying she wanted nothing to do with him and didn't want him interfering in her life again. She picked up the phone and called for an ambulance. Mike, feeling scared and overwhelmed, went to the garden and sat there, deeply shaken and full of regret over what he had done. Mike then heard the sound of an ambulance approaching, consumed with fear and remorse for his actions. And that's how today's story ends. We hope you enjoyed watching. Don't forget to support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel.